Despite being known as one of the foremost neoliberal, free trading, and globalist nations in the world today, America domestically has grappled with the argument of global integration versus isolationist protectionism. Much of this argument comes from the state of America prior to the end of the Second World War. Protectionism versus free trade in the US have a myriad history in the nation. Initially, from the early days of the nation, well into the 20th century, the US was strongly rooted in protectionist policies, mainly for a desire to protect internal economic interests, raise revenue via tariffs, and prevent more efficient markets from destroying domestic industries, caused the US government to issue harsh tariffs throughout the entire 19th and early 20th century. After achieving independence from the United Kingdom, the early United States was exceptionally under-industrialized for a country of its size. Much of this was due to the meddling of a former colonial overlord. After finding itself under-industrialized, the early period of American economics can best be described as a catching up period. A period when the US was required to take otherwise extreme methods to manage to match industrial outputs that was expected for a nation of its magnitude. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasurer of the United States, was a leading figure in the push for the industrialization of America and the growth of the early American economy. He created something known as the American School. Hamilton, in his magnum opus, The Report on Manufactories, argued that the United States would never rise to becoming fully independent and stable nation until her own industrial and economic base was that of, if not above, Britain's, which the US was easily able to achieve given the opportunity. Hamilton devised a plan under what is known as infant industry protection, which, while first understood in the British Isles, was perfected and revolutionized under Hamilton. He argued for higher tariffs and subsidies to be given to early American industries for their own protection and to prevent other foreign industries from flooding American markets with non-American produced goods. He recognized that while in the short term a price increase would occur, overall, once American industry matched those of the great powers, the prices would become cheaper in the long run. Tariffs from Hamiltonian economics would be some of the highest in the world at the time, at a flat rate of 5% in 1789, and moved to 12.5% in 1792. This tariff would again be raised to 25% during the War of 1812 to help cover the cost of running the US government. Although Hamilton was dead by the time of the war, he would have been a strong advocate for this measure. Hamilton was an ardent believer of using tariffs to offset the cost of government and using them in part of protection of infant and new industries in the nascent nation. However, after the War of 1812, the incredibly high 25% tariff would remain in usage, especially on key goods such as cotton and various metal goods. This tariff was to protect American agricultural and mining interests within the nation. From this point onward, the American system would be developed. Also known as the national system, it will be championed by Henry Clay, one of the leading congressmen of the day and widely considered one of America's most influential post-founding father figures. Clay would further develop the American School of Economics and believed that a strong tariff and high degree of protectionism would help build the American economy into a great power. Clay's ideals would see Americans' tariffs skyrocket until reaching a peak in 1828 with the now infamous Tariff of Abomination. Tariffs on imported goods reached 38% and on some raw goods up to 45%. This ludicrously high tariff was despised throughout the US South and Midwest, both of which were very agricultural. The South had historically always been against US protectionism. This spawned from the issue that the South, being agricultural, found plenty of markets outside the US to sell into. The United Kingdom, France, and other major European states had long been nominal trade partners with the South, and this high tariff was seen as an alienation of these trading allies. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, this was not the Rust Belt we know it is today. Still, much like the South, it was very agricultural, and the Clay Tariff was fought harshly by the two regions. This tariff would eventually lead to the similarly infamous event known as the Nullification Crisis, when South Carolina attempted to override federal tariffs. This one event is considered the earliest political event in which would evolve into the U.S. Civil War. Clay argued that these high tariffs would eventually be beneficial to the South and Midwest, however. Clay saw the early industrialization of the Midwest and advocated both to the Midwest and his friends in Congress that this was the best solution to building what would become the Rust Belt. The South, Clay argued, had northern mills which desperately needed cotton and other agricultural needs that was not being met due to the lack of good irrigatable land in the North. Neither the South or the Midwest saw it this way, but Clay would eventually win years after the tariff as protectionism was introduced as the primary form of American trade policy in 1842. The compromise was made to sedate South Carolina and the nullification crisis was over, and the federal government opted to continue using strong tariffs and protectionist policies for the economic growth of the nation. Throughout the 19th century, even during the U.S. Civil War, protectionism was the ideal system in the U.S. This system saw industries once thought to be reserved by the European great powers spring up in the U.S. The American system saw the American economy rise from a relatively under-industrialized backwater rogue nation to, by the end of the 19th century, the second largest economy in the world, only challenged by the British Empire at its zenith. U.S. protectionism came to an end under the Wilson administration. A foreign policy master, Wilson desired to better connect the U.S. with the world at large. Dropping tariffs, he created income taxes to help offset the loss of revenue. After Wilson and the Democrats were ousted slightly prior to the Great Depression, in 1930, after the Depression hit, Republicans attempted to reintroduce high tariffs and protectionism in the Smoot-Hawley Act, which backfired miserably. The high tariffs seeking to return to pre-Wilsonian protectionism saw all the nominal trade partners of the U.S. smack the U.S. with high, if not higher, tariffs, which crippled the American trade and caused the Great Depression in the U.S. to become even worse. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would undo the act, realizing its failure, but did not manage to undo the effects the tariffs had on the U.S., and instead had to rebuild the American economy in what would become the New Deal. After the fiasco of the Smoot-Hawley Act and later World War II, seeing the U.S. implement Lend-Lease and otherwise early free trading agreements, in 1947 the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs would be signed. GATT for short. This organization in 1995 will become what we know today as the World Trade Organization. This early free trading agreement ultimately brought about the end of American protectionism as we know it. As the US was now a superpower and the leader of Western democracies, the only major Western nation not suffering from economic collapse after the war, the US changed from an internal focus to a global focus. The emphasis on free trade was built originally to bolster Western Europe, but was soon discovered to have beneficial aspects to the US as well. Just as members of what would become NATO profited from US free trade, the US was also able to profit from free trade. For the first time in the history of the US, the middle class was able to obtain international goods and luxury items at an affordable price. Furthermore, the U.S. companies was also able to produce at a cheaper rate than ever by purchasing resources and manufactured goods abroad. The change in trade policies also led to a rising of U.S. services dominating the global industry. Today, American financial services are some of the largest and most powerful in the international stage, all benefits of free trade. In the postmodern era, the U.S. has had to come to grips, however, with its free trading policies. Problems such as unemployment, claims of intellectual theft, and overpowering of American industries, combined with international political polarization, caused a massive change in both policy and public desire for free trade. Protectionism, while seemingly as the only viable alternative, is not without its flaws as well. Economically, it will cripple a nation's ability to function at maximum economic efficiency and will also alienate valuable economic allies. Whatever becomes of either trading system in the US has tried protectionism in the past with success. However, given the success and benefits of free trade on the flip side, perhaps other solutions to balancing the industrial challenge of America should be evaluated.